Hello, everyone. First of all, I'd like to thank the Sharq Forum for inviting me to address this very exciting conference. I'm very glad to be here. I was asked to talk to you about the Peace of Westphalia. First off, I should begin by mentioning what it was. It was a peace treaty which ended one of the most destructive and terrible wars in European history, the 30 Years' War in 1648. It was signed between the German emperor and the German princes on the one hand, and France and Sweden on the other hand. It set up a system of collective security. It successfully pacified and neutralized Central Europe, and it secured the religious and political rights of minorities. You might wonder, why is this of relevance today? Why am I talking about this? And it's a fair question. I would argue that the series of conflicts that Europeans underwent in those days, in the first half of the 17th century, was in many ways remarkably similar to what the Middle Eastern region now is undergoing. And this recognition opens up a completely new channel and new avenues towards thinking about potential solutions to security problems in this region. I don't really need to remind anyone that the Middle East today is experiencing a security crisis. Since the 1970s, or perhaps longer, the region has witnessed a series of interconnected wars and conflicts, resulting in a cycle of violence to which there seems to be no end in sight. 400 years ago, the Holy Roman Empire, which was a extremely decentralized, largely German state in the center of Europe, was similarly somewhat of a disaster zone in Europe, in the sense that it spewed out internal conflict. Its conflicts would spew out instability and also attract intervention. The 30 Years' War, which raged between 1618 and 1648, resulted in the death of about a third of the entire German population, a result of the atrocities such as these that you can see here. At the time, this crisis in Europe seemed equally, if not more, intractable than the current crisis in the Middle East. But the fact that the participants nevertheless miraculously managed to overcome these problems after years of negotiation and to successfully set up a peace settlement has inspired a number of us at the Kerber Foundation, which is based in Hamburg, and the University of Cambridge, to initiate a project entitled A Westphalia for the Middle East. In addition to a number of publications, we've mainly been focusing on workshops and conferences which draw in participants from the UN, the Arab League, the EU, and other institutions. The aim of the project is to provide regional players with lessons from the Peace of Westphalia, to serve as an inspiration for a potential new security order in the Middle East, not by imposing an external model, but rather by trying to encourage a settlement reached by the local actors on the basis of techniques and mechanisms that proved to be so successful in the historical record. And the analytical starting point, in many ways, is the recognition that there are a number of parallels between the 30 Years' War and the Middle Eastern conflict now. The most obvious one being the incredible complexity of the struggles involved, with numerous non-state, sub-state actors fighting asymmetrical power conflicts in a multipolar international environment. In the 30 Years' War, as well as in Syria, hostilities began with internal rebellions before then incrementally escalating into broader conflicts through the involvement of outside powers, firstly through proxy wars, before then moving on to direct military intervention. Thus, the conflict, which began in the Holy Roman Empire with the internal rebellion against the Habsburgs in Austria, then unexpectedly led to a number of external interventions, first by Spain and the Netherlands, but then also by Denmark, and most seriously by Sweden and France. And a very similar chain of events has been occurring in Syria, where the rebellion has also resulted in the exporting of instability and the importing of intervention. Another important parallel is the role of religion. In both cases, it has tended to exacerbate political and constitutional struggles while also taking on a dynamic of its own. So before moving on to the lessons that we can draw from Westphalia, I'd like to say a little bit about how the peace is perceived, because there's still a tremendous amount of misunderstanding relating to the Peace of Westphalia. So contrary to what is often asserted in political science and the media, it had almost nothing to do with sovereignty. It did not inaugurate a modern system of equal nation-states, and it did not enshrine the principle of non-intervention in other states' domestic affairs. Actually, it had quite the opposite effect, because by placing the religious and political rights of minorities and other groups within the Holy Roman Empire under international guarantee, it thereby opened up new channels for intervention, or at least supervision, of other states' constitutional arrangements by external guarantor powers. And detailed research by historians over the last 20 years or so has successfully debunked this myth of the so-called Westphalian system. And the reason I'm saying this is because the history of the real Westphalia, as it actually was, and in terms of the real effects it had, is potentially more useful for the Middle East, precisely because it is in this region that the old sovereign nation-state model, which is incorrectly attributed often to Westphalia, is widely perceived to have failed. So which lessons can be drawn? Here we can distinguish between three main types of lessons. Firstly, peacemaking tools, in other words, diplomatic techniques and mechanisms which proved to be effective in producing an eventual peace treaty. Secondly, instruments of peace, in other words, the treaty content itself, although this is going to be less important because there's obvious difficulties and problems in terms of transporting treaty content from a different region and epoch. And thirdly, securing the peace, in other words, mechanisms which were devised to ensure the longevity of the settlement in the future. The complexity and multi-layered nature of conflicts in the 30 Years' War meant that attempts to solve individual parts of them would usually fail. And similarly, what we have discussed in our workshops is that the range of conflicts and grievances in the Middle East now is too complex and interwoven to be successfully addressed by piecemeal negotiations looking at individual parts of the broader regional crisis. Therefore, what's needed is an inclusive peace congress that draws in all parties to conflict in order to negotiate a new security order for the region. Another parallel leads to another lesson, namely the more or less paranoid security fears about the supposed hegemonic aims of the other side. So, just as this assumption afflicted the Habsburgs and France then, so it also stifles trust between Iran and Saudi Arabia now, for example. So what is needed is for all participants to openly and transparently set out their core security interests at the outset. Now, skeptics might argue that such an all-inclusive grand bargain deal for the whole region is unrealistic, but here I think it's helpful to look at the historical record, which shows that obstacles which were similarly, if not more daunting, were actually successfully overcome in the 1640s. So at Westphalia, the peace for Central Europe was achieved despite the fact that not all of the major parties had reached a state of exhaustion, and despite the fact that a ceasefire was not even in place during the entire duration of the negotiations, which was 5 years. And so this sort of highly ambitious nature of the settlement, I think, serves to underline its instructive potential. Also, the process shows that the absence of trust should not really prevent negotiations from getting started in the first place. Actually, it's the peace process which should generate trust, not necessarily the other way around. What is particularly instructive about the content is, I think, the Westphalian method of enabling confessional coexistence by dealing with sectarian conflict through legal judicial and political means, whereby intractable questions of theological truth were disregarded. Another aspect worth emulating is the creation of an externally guaranteed and regionally specified security zone for parts of the region, which would thereby be removed from ongoing geopolitical rivalry. Making viable arrangements to secure the peace in the longer term, I think, is one of the most crucial aspects of any settlement, not only in order to prevent the resumption of hostilities, but also to instill trust in the actors in the first place, which gives them confidence to give peace a chance and to enter into negotiations. And here we come to one of the main aspects of Westphalia, namely its mutual guarantee. Thereby, each signatory became a guarantor and pledged to defend by force, if necessary, the entire peace treaty, every single term of the whole settlement. And so thereby a system of collective security was established, which was important as a deterrent against future breaches of the peace, but also in order to defend the rights that were enshrined at Westphalia. So it turned out to be an important peace-conserving tool in the longer term, and it was effective precisely because the guarantors had a vested geopolitical self-interest in ensuring that its terms were upheld. In other words, they were not too distant and disinterested. And it's likely that for any Middle Eastern peace settlement to be successful, it would also need to be similarly placed under a system of a sort of two-tier system of guarantee, including both regional and international guarantors. Another important lesson, I think, is that the guarantors must not only be prepared to intervene and to police norms of behavior between states, but also crucially within states, because international instability often results from internal unrest, as we've seen in the last few years. So in conclusion, I'd like to mention that, of course, history does not repeat itself, and one must be aware of cultural, geographical, and temporal differences. So Westphalia cannot really be imposed as some sort of blueprint to the current context. However, a deeper understanding of history can serve to help us better understand analogous processes that are happening now. And therefore, from this vantage point, we can see that it does offer a number of useful mechanisms and instruments. And it's up to historians as well as politicians and regional players to identify these and extract these in order to make them more useful for diplomacy today. Thank you.